Okay, we have been simplifying ratios, so we're going to move on to actually taking those ratios and solving proportions. And this is the first video of two videos for solving proportions. And the definition of a proportion is simply an equation that states that two ratios are equal. So let's look at a really simple example of this. Something as simple as 1/2, which is a ratio, 1 to 2. So 1/2 equals 4/8. So thinking back to when you're in middle school, ask yourself, does 4/8 reduce to 1/2, or are these equivalent fractions? And they are. So this is just a real simple example of a proportion. Now let's take that information there and let's look at this example. In this proportion we have m. We have something missing as far as our numerator is concerned here, and we're going to solve this using what you all know about solving equations. Okay? Now, if I were to rewrite this, when we were solving one-step equations and you came across a problem like this, if you ever asked me a question or talked to anyone and wanted to find out, what do I do? How do I get the m by itself? My first question would be to ask you, well, what does this fraction bar mean? How does the 12, or how is the 12 attached to the m? What is going on here? And this is, hopefully what you would say, this is division. That's what your fraction bar means. So the inverse operation of dividing by 12, if I want to solve this for m, would simply be to multiply by 12. So this is actually a proportion that we can solve just like we've been solving equations. So if I multiply this side by 12, that will divide out, and so I am left with my m on the right hand side. And on the left hand side, I just simply have 12 times 7/8, which if you type that in your calculator will give you 10.5. So very simple way to solve for m, just using what you know about solving equations. So take that and solve this one. Pause the video and solve this equation for x. Okay, I wanted you to try to solve this equation for x based on the information that you know from solving equations. So without rewriting this, if this is division, which is what our fraction bar means, division, if this is dividing by 7, the inverse of that would be to multiply by 7. So I'm kind of right on top of my words here. I'm going to multiply both sides here by 7. Well, if I multiply this side by 7, this will divide out, and I'm left with my x. And then on the other side, I'll have the fraction 4/5 times 7. And 4/5 times 7, just type that in your calculator, gives you 5.6. So very simple to solve these equations. And again, these are proportions, but we're solving them based on the information we have from our solving our equations. So let's think of another way to solve proportions, and this is probably something that you've already you've seen this before, so you should recognize this. Cross products, or you all may think of it as cross multiplication. Cross products of proportions are equal. Okay, so cross multiplication, for example, it has the algebra here. If I have the fraction a over b equals c over d, one restriction they have here is that b and d cannot equal 0. And think back to when you've learned things about fractions and division, that sort of thing. We cannot have 0 in the denominator. We cannot divide by 0. That's why there is this restriction. But then they have the rest of the statement, AD equals BC. They have multiply, cross multiplication, A times D, and then B times C. So if you look at the example that I have typed out here for you, 3/4 equals 9/12. It's very similar to the one at the beginning of the video. You should be able to look at 9/12 and see, does this reduce to 3/4? And it will. But using cross products, since our cross products have to be equal, if I multiply 3 times 12 and then multiply 4 times 9, both of those will equal 36. So cross products of a proportion will be equal. And so this is another way that you can solve proportions. So let's look at using cross multiplication, cross products, to solve this proportion. Same basic way that you could solve this using what you know about solving equations, but this is a little bit different than the other two because we do actually have our variable in the denominator. So that would make it a little more difficult for us if we were trying to solve this as an equation and not just a proportion. So let's look at solving this using cross products. Using cross products, this would tell us we would need to multiply the 4 times the x. So 4 times x, that's all you're doing, cross product, cross multiplication, simply gives you 4x. And then we'll multiply the other two together. Multiply your 3 times your 8 together. And notice a lot of times, just try to catch this error that a lot of people will create. A lot of people want to make this into a fraction, and they want to put the 3 times the 8 below the 4x. When you use cross multiplication, all you are doing is designing or manipulating this problem into an equation that's easier for you to solve. So once you multiply 4 times x, that's going to be equal to whatever you get when you cross multiply with the other two numbers. So make this real simple on yourself. Don't try to start creating other fractions and that sort of thing. Really what you're doing is you're trying to eliminate having fractions in your equation. So if you multiply 3 times your 8, you do get 24. And you have a one-step equation. Again, as a review, these two are attached by multiplication. There is not a sign between the two. When you have a number, a coefficient, and a variable side by side, this indicates multiplication. So the inverse of multiplication would be division. So I'm going to divide both sides by 4. 4 divided by 4 gives me 1. So I'm left with my 1x. And 24 divided by 4 is 6. So x is 6. And you can always plug your 6 in up here for your fraction and see, does 4 times 6 equals 3 times 8? And it does. 4 times 6 is 24. You could also look to see, does 8 over 6 reduce to 4/3? And that is also true. So different ways you can go back and check your solution to make sure that it is correct. So use cross multiplication, cross products, and solve this problem here on your own. Okay, this one you could solve using cross multiplication, or you could solve like a one-step equation because your variable is in the numerator of this problem. But we're going to solve this one. I'm going to solve it using cross multiplication. So the first thing I'm going to multiply is y times 5, which is simply 5y. And then I'm going to multiply the other two together, 3 times 3, which gives me 9. So 5y equals 9. One-step equation, the inverse of multiplying by 5 is dividing by 5. So 5 divided by 5 is 1. I'm left with 1y. And you do get a decimal on this one. 9 divided by 5 gives you 1.8. So this one is a little more difficult to go back and see, will 1.8 over 3 reduce to 3/5? Well, it's inappropriate. It's not correct, I guess, to write a decimal over a fraction or in the numerator. You would have to simplify this to determine if it will be 3/5. So you can't just look at it like you can on others, but you could still cross multiply 1.8 times 5 and 3 times 3, and you will get 9 for both of those. So 1.8 is the correct answer. Now, those two were fairly simple, and all of them we've done so far are fairly simple. So let's look at one that's a little more complex. The difference in this example and the other two that we've had are the number of terms in the numerator. This numerator has two terms, a b and a -8, so that creates b minus 8. This one also has two terms, a b and a +3, which creates b plus 3. So we're going to definitely use cross multiplication here to simplify this problem and to solve this proportion, but we have to be very, very careful with how we design this problem. So what we need to do, my suggestion is, you know that you've got to multiply this numerator by this denominator. But what you have to keep in mind is that everything in this numerator has to be multiplied by the denominator. So if you want to eliminate making mistakes here, I would take the 4. I know that number 4 has to be multiplied by everything in the numerator, which in this case is a b minus 8. So I'm going to put that in parentheses. So I'm simply just setting up the multiplication problem here. I'm not actually multiplying anything yet. And this is going to be equal to, and I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing for the other side, 5 times b plus 3. Everything up here must be multiplied by 5. So again, I'm going to write my problem out. Rather than multiplying, I'm going to just set this up. 5 times the quantity of b plus 3. So what this ensures me, if I actually take the time to write this step down, is that I make sure that I multiply everything that is required. So hopefully at this point you recognize this, if I got a number outside the parentheses, that this is distributive property. So 4 times b is 4b, and then 4 times negative 8 is negative 32. Then I have to do the same thing on the other side. I've got to distribute 5 times b is 5b, and then 5 times a positive 3 is a positive 15. So what this has created for me is not a one-step equation like the others, but this was actually a two-step equation, actually a multi-step equation. You've got variables on both sides, so you're going to have to move several terms in this problem. So my suggestion is to always try to move the smaller coefficient to the larger coefficient. 4b is smaller than 5b. And that just helps to eliminate using negatives very often. So if this is a positive 4b, I don't want to divide because that'll break these apart. I want to move this as one term. So subtract, the inverse of a positive 4b is a negative 4b. Negative subtraction, same thing. So if I subtract 4b from the left-hand side, I'm going to subtract 4b from the right-hand side. Now, be very, very careful. This is 0, but don't forget about what you have left over on this side of the equation. And I'm actually going to bring my work up over here. You do have a negative 32 still left on that side of the equation, so be careful with your signs. And then I have 5b minus 4b. 5 minus 4 is just simply 1, so I'm left with 1b, and that's what I need for my final answer is 1b. So then I have my plus 15. Now I have a one-step equation. To move a positive 15 to the other side, I'm going to have to subtract 15. And if I subtract 15 from the right-hand side, I have to make sure that I subtract 15 from the left-hand side. And negative 32 minus 15 gives you negative 47. Is b, because remember this became 0. So negative 47 is the value of b that will make these two ratios equal, which is what you have to have for a proportion. Now my suggestion is to go back and plug negative 47 in for b, and simplify this numerator. Plug negative 47 in for b, simplify this numerator, and double check to make sure that your ratios are equivalent. If they aren't, then this will not be the correct answer. It does work in this case, but it's always good practice to go back and make sure of your answer. Now what I'd like for you to do is to try this proportion. The answer or the solution that I will show you for this answer, for this problem, will be in the second video. So go ahead and make sure you have this problem. Try it on your own before moving on to video number 2.